Well, hi everyone. My name is Jared Yarnell Shane. I'm the entrepreneurial lead with Thought for Food, and with me is Jessica Menold.
Hi, everyone.
She's my friend. She's studying here at Pennsylvania State University, and she is currently a PhD candidate in mechanical engineering with a focus on design theory.
Yes.
So Jess, can you explain a little bit more about what you're studying and some of the findings from your research?
Sure. So I'm studying prototyping, specifically within design theory methodology. So I'm looking at how new products develop prototypes, or how do companies develop new products through prototypes. I think it's like $141 billion is wasted by the top 10 Fast Company 100 or whatever companies on R&D. The biggest sunk cost is prototyping. So that's where you spend a lot of your time, a lot of your resources. And that 141 billion is on failed products, so products that don't make it to the market at all or don't have high enough return on investment. And so that's a lot of money, right?
Yes.
So I am particularly interested in looking at prototyping and how designers and companies build prototypes, how we can make it more efficient through a structured framework that we call Prototype for X.
Awesome. And can you share some different examples of what prototypes are, or how to begin thinking about prototypes?
So a prototype can be anything, in my opinion. So it can be a user survey, it can be a PowerPoint that you fake out an app with by hyperlinking the slides. It can be a physical product made out of cardboard, or it can be on the total opposite end, a highly functional, almost to assembly line version of your product. So it can pretty much be anything. I think what makes it a prototype is that you are using it to test a core assumption about your design or your concept. And to me, that's the critical crux of what Prototype for X relies on.
Awesome. And I know you've told me before in your research you have kind of 3 different focus areas on what prototypes are. Can you explain what those 3 different focus areas are?
So my research draws a lot from human-centered design. And so we have 3 different focus areas for how to build a prototype. One of them is prototyping for feasibility, prototyping for viability, and prototyping for desirability. So feasibility is concerned with the technical quality of your device, making it all actually work together.
So that's like testing a new technology.
Testing a new technology, building subsystems out, doing the CAD models, those type of things. Prototyping for viability is more concerned with the financial aspects. So is it economically viable to get your product into the market? Do you have enough time? Do you have enough control over the resources? And then the third one, prototyping for desirability, kind of obvious. Can you actually make people want or desire your product? And so you build prototypes to really test that.
Gotcha. Cool. Thank you. And within your research, you said you were focusing on one specific example. I think you said a vacuum, right?
Right. Yeah.
Can you talk about how you were testing a prototype of a vacuum and how you tested the
Each
3
one?
different? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So we studied specifically the creation of handheld vacuums because it's a mass product, right? It's a consumer good, easy to study. And so we looked at the prototype for desirability, prototype for viability, and prototype for feasibility within creating a handheld vacuum. And then looked at ultimately when the teams produced their final design, if they were better than teams who just prototyped kind of in the wild. So teams who created a prototype for desirability for vacuums oftentimes would not at all worry about any of the internal components, right? Because there's obviously a lot to make a vacuum actually suck things up. So they wouldn't worry about any of that. They would instead build either using 3D printers or cardboard. They would build out the entire outside case of it. And they would kind of figure out the right distribution of weights. So they would give it to users, watch how they held it, watch how they reacted to the shape and form. Sometimes if a user was only concerned about the power of the suction or something, they would build out that subsystem. But most oftentimes we saw prototyping for desirability led to worrying a lot about the form, the ergonomics of the vacuum.
So the things that people see when they look right at the vacuum.
Right.
Or
So what are the features that are gonna make them buy it?
Okay.
The prototype for feasibility was looking at all of the different subsystems of the vacuum.
Okay.
So some people would identify, it's really important that I can switch out different nozzles. That's the critical assumption, is that if I have different nozzles, it'll increase the suction power or something like that. So they would 3D print many different nozzles and see which one created more of a suction.
Okay.
Other teams would identify the turbine blades and like that whole subsystem, so that electromechanical system was really critical to the vacuum being a success. And so they would build out only that subsystem, and they would keep iterating on that prototype until they got it right. Once they got it right, they would move on to another subsystem. So they were really just working to increase the technical quality of the design.
Awesome.
And prototyping for viability, really quickly. The teams, this kind of happened, normally it's a normal flow that you would typically start with desirability, then move to feasibility, then to viability. Okay. You can switch desirability to feasibility, but you kind of always end on viability, just because it's right before you manufacture. You don't have to, you can do it any way you want, but the teams who were doing viability would focus a lot on reducing the part count. So getting rid of screws, getting rid of different assembly motions, so just really simplifying the design so that you would have fewer parts that you needed to actually mass produce. You would have fewer assembly directions, so a shorter assembly time. So really reducing the overall cost of it when you go to scale. So
viability is focused a lot on manufacturing and the cost of goods to make sure that it's something that will be viable and actually work within the marketplace.
Exactly.
Gotcha. Okay. Awesome. So before we hop into the questions from the teams, how do you identify which of the three focus areas, feasibility, viability, and desirability? How do you choose which questions to address when you're looking to create a prototype?
So I think one thing to start with, I'll tell two quick stories from my startups, just because that's how it's easiest for me to think about it. So I have a startup designing educational toys, and I have another startup, and we developed a prosthetic device. So two very different things. But we've prototyped a lot. So for the prosthetic device, we've had about 60 or so prototypes. For the toys, I'm on my 20th.
Wow. That's a lot of prototypes.
It's a lot of prototypes. So what we have as a team for both of them have constantly asked is what's the critical assumption that we're making right now, that if it is wrong, will sink us. And so once we identify that, we ask how we can test it in the quickest, most efficient way. We build a prototype as fast as possible to test that one thing.
Can you talk about, do you remember with Amparo, that's the prosthetic company?
Right.
Do you remember your first prototype and what you were testing or what your assumption was there?
I do. So for our first prototype, we actually just wanted to see if we could do it.
Okay.
Right. So it was a very basic question about technical feasibility. Can we create a prototype or a prosthetic socket that works like a mouth guard that you can boil, take it off, slip it on, and make a limb, right? So we're really just concerned with that. So what we did was just look at shin guards that are already mass produced that you boil and slip on your knee and kind of form. So we just kind of hacked them together and made a really functional prototype to prove, okay, if we get the right material, we can make this work.
Cool.
But then every consecutive one past that has been, how can we make this desirable for users?
So you identified desirability as one of the top things.
Yeah, so the first thing we tested was feasibility. And then once we got feasibility and we knew it was technically possible to do it, then we started saying, well, how will people actually react to this?
Okay.
And now we're much more thinking about how can we mass produce it. So it's much more in the viability range.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Jess.
Yeah.
Awesome. So we're going to hop into some team questions here. We've got a lot of questions coming in, and we chose three that we think really help give a good idea on the whole prototyping process. So the first question is from Rohit from Team Blue Green, and his question was, we are creating novel features that work with a pre-existing system. Do we have to test both the novel and pre-existing technologies together, or can we just focus on the new technologies that we have created?
Yeah. So I think that this is definitely a question about feasibility, right? So it's integrating into existing components, new subsystems. So I would suggest that you kind of nail down and get the novel subsystem of your overall product working. And then once you have that working really, really well, I would take a look at what exists on the market. If this technology is really feasible and you have maybe competitors that do it, maybe you could buy one, kind of hack it apart and connect it to yours in a really simple way. So I would just first worry about getting the novel subsystem down, then look at if we can integrate it with off-the-shelf components. And if you can't do that, I don't necessarily think it's a hindrance. You probably could get away with just showing the novel component, as long as your audience has enough of a technical background to understand how it could easily be integrated.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yep.
Thanks, Jess. So the second question comes from Martin from Team Aqua Organics. And the question is, our team is focused on growing produce by utilizing aquaponics. Aquaponics, growing fish at the same time as grow plants. We have created the growing system. However, the fish and produce will not be ready by the January 8th pitch deadline. So how can we test if people will want to buy our goods?
So I think this is one of we call it a Wizard of Oz prototype. So it's basically like you make it seem like your prototype fully works and everything's there and it's good to go. However, it's really not. But you don't tell the users that. So what I would suggest is that you get somebody who's really good at Photoshop and you have them take some plants and take some fish and kind of Photoshop them onto a photo of your prototype. Then maybe take a video of the prototype you currently have without anything growing in it, which I think will be fine. But just kind of create a quick, almost like a Kickstarter type video, and then you can gauge user feedback by pre-orders, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you can get people to actually pre-order your tank, then you know that you've got a viable thing, and you don't really need to worry about the timeline.
So in this case, aquaponics has already proven to be feasible, right?
Right.
So what you need to test now is desirability.
Right.
How do you make this a product that people want to buy?
Exactly. Yeah. So you could do a lot more on the usability side, where you show them existing products where aquaponics already works well, or you kind of Photoshop it into your product, and you just ask them, what price point they would want to pay, just the typical user questions to kind of gauge the marketability of your product.
Awesome. Okay, great. So the last question is from Lawrence from Team Sparky, and the question is, an important part of our design is the manufacturing and cost of the goods we produce. How can we prototype this to prove that our concept is viable on the market?
Sure. So there's a lot of great online tools for looking at, if you want to do in-house manufacturing of your components, you can go online and there's a lot of good estimation tools for gauging how much tooling, marketing, all of those things are going to cost you by your batch size. So let's say you have a batch size of 1,000, you can kind of gauge how much things will cost and then work backwards to get the price per unit from there.
Do you remember off the top of your head any of these tools?
I can send you some of them.
Yeah.
You can also, if you have any of the CAD programs, SolidWorks, AutoCAD, Autodesk, any of those type of things, and you're using that, you can also, they have great estimation tools in there for mass manufacturing. You can do it by batch size. I think then the only other thing I would look at is, what can your team kind of go to vendors for? So what can you buy off-the-shelf components from other people? Because if you can buy them at wholesale, it's much cheaper. You don't have to worry about getting the tooling or the manufacturing together, and then you only need to make the parts that are new and novel. You kind of just integrate them from there.
Cool. So a good prototype for them might be, if you can't do it yourselves, find someone who can help you do a CAD model and do some of these estimations.
Right, do an estimation. And then also, if you go talk to some tooling and die makers or anybody in manufacturing in your particular field, they'll be able to give you some really good estimates of how much you can expect to spend.
Awesome. Okay. So those are all our questions. I have one last question for you, Jess, and that's just, you said you've done 60 prototypes with Amparo, 20 with your other business. Is there one prototype that stands out in your mind as either being a huge failure or a huge success? And can you talk about what it was and what you learned from that?
Yeah, so with the toy company, we're creating different types of brackets. And
Rockets, you said? Sorry.
Brackets.
Okay.
And just for kids to play with recyclable materials really quickly and actually build them out into full-blown like rocket ships and crazy different space things, which sounds ridiculous, but it works. It's very fun. So I came up with a new concept to make a bracket completely adjustable by angle. And so I tested all of the new features that I wanted to create at once, and it snapped apart. It broke immediately. What I realized was that I needed to nail down the interface between the two brackets first, and then I could worry about the different angles, and then I could worry about subsequent features. So for me, it was great because it failed immediately and I saw what was wrong with it. But I realized I needed to go in a sequential order of figuring out one feature, and then that would kind of set the constraints for the next few features.
And you determined that the most important feature was how they would connect together.
Exactly.
So that was the most important assumption that you had.
Yes,
and you needed to
the bracket worked fine in and of itself, but if it didn't actually fit together, so it was kind of an issue.
Okay. Well, awesome. Thank you so much, Jess. Thank you guys for listening, for sending in your questions, and good luck with the TFF Challenge. Remember to get your pitches in by January 8th. Bye.
Bye.